The air was thick with humidity, as it always was in this part of the South, the kind of air that clung to your skin, leaving a film of sweat no matter how much you tried to wipe it away. The oppressive weight of the heat, however, wasn't the only thing that suffocated the city. A deep, unspoken tension simmered beneath the surface, as old as the cracked sidewalks and rusted signs that dotted the streets. It was the kind of tension that whispered in every corner, every glance, and every heavy silence. Alicia James knew this city too well. She had lived here all her life. Born and raised in the heart of the South, she had learned from an early age how to read the eyes of people who didn't need to say a word to make her feel like she didn't belong, how to hear the slurs beneath the polite greetings, how to walk with her head high despite the weight of a system that had been built to crush people like her mother, and like her brother. It wasn't just the streets that bore the weight of history, it was the eyes that followed her every step, the whispers that followed her through every store aisle, and the sickeningly sweet smile of the clerk who made sure to avoid touching the same pen she had touched. The feeling of isolation, not just physical, but something deeper, more haunting. That was what Alicia had learned to live with, to fight against, even when the fight felt impossible. But today, something would break. The morning began like any other, the sun shining bright, the birds singing their tired song in the trees, and Alicia preparing for her walk with her dogs, Bruno and Daisy. It was the one time of day when the world seemed a little less harsh, when the weight of everything didn't feel so unbearable. Bruno, her Rottweiler, and Daisy, her lab, were more than just pets. They were her companions, her family, and on this humid morning, they would become her only defense. As she stepped outside, the heat hit her immediately. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, before turning to her dogs. Bruno barked excitedly, pulling at his leash, while Daisy sat patiently by her side, her eyes alert, always watching. The rhythmic sound of their paws on the pavement was the only noise that accompanied her as they walked down the block. But then, a police car appeared at the end of the street. Alicia barely noticed at first, but the moment the car slowed down, she knew. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the undeniable, familiar dread. She'd been stopped by the police more times than she could count in her life, but never with her dogs by her side. She kept walking, hoping it would pass, but it didn't. Instead, the car pulled up beside her, and the officer inside rolled down the window. He didn't smile, didn't say anything kind, just stared at her. "Where you going?" he asked, his voice cold, hard, and unfriendly. "Just walking my dogs," Alicia replied, trying to sound casual, trying to hide the rising anxiety that had begun to tighten her chest. "Why you out here?" The officer's eyes narrowed, as if trying to see into her soul. "A walk is just a walk," she said, keeping her voice steady, but inside, her heart was pounding now. She knew the drill. She knew what was coming. The officer's eyes never left Alicia's face. There was something predatory in his gaze, as if he had already made up his mind about her. He didn't care that she was just a woman out for a morning walk, a woman with her dogs, trying to escape the weight of a world that constantly judged her for the color of her skin. No, in his eyes, Alicia was already guilty. Alicia felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten. Her pulse began to race. She knew this drill. She had been through it before, the subtle racism that didn't need to shout, the kind that sat quietly under the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. But now, there was something more in the air, something darker, something that told her this wasn't just a routine stop. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" the officer asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. She opened her mouth to respond but was cut off before she could speak. "Where are you headed?" His tone was commanding, not asking. His hand rested on his gun belt. "I'm just walking my dogs," Alicia said again, her voice steady but with a hint of tension she couldn't hide. "Just walking your dogs?" He repeated the words like they were a crime in themselves. Seems like a strange time for that. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on her chest. Bruno growled softly, a low rumble that vibrated in the ground beneath her feet, but Alicia quickly tugged on his leash to calm him. Daisy remained still, her eyes locked on the officer, but Alicia could sense the dog's muscles tense, ready to defend. "Yes, just walking my dogs. Is that a problem?" Alicia asked, her voice firmer now. The officer stepped closer. He was just a few feet away now, his shadow casting over her like a weight she couldn't shake. Alicia felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Bruno growled again, louder this time, and Daisy took a step forward, instinctively positioning herself between the officer and Alicia. The officer looked down at the dogs, his eyes narrowing. His lips curled into a sneer. "You have a lot of nerve, lady," he said, his voice laced with disdain. Alicia stood her ground, but inside, her heart was racing. She could feel the anger welling up inside her, the feeling of being trapped by a system that didn't see her, that didn't care about her. She didn't want to provoke them, but she wasn't about to back down either. Not today. "Listen," Alicia said, her voice low but clear. "I'm just trying to go for a walk. If you've got an issue with that, take it up with someone else." The officer didn't respond immediately. For a moment, it seemed like he was considering her words, but then he looked at his partner, who had been sitting in the patrol car, watching the whole scene unfold. The second officer nodded slightly, and Alicia knew then that things were about to escalate. The air felt electric now, crackling with a tension that made her muscles tighten, ready for anything. Before we continue, let's take a brief pause. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you experienced anything similar in your life? Share your thoughts, your stories, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's dive back into the narrative. The silence between Alicia and the officers stretched on, thick and suffocating. The officer in front of her took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on hers, cold and unyielding. His partner, still seated in the patrol car, didn't move. He was watching, but his presence only made the situation feel even more oppressive. "Move along, lady," the officer spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Ain't nobody got time for your dog-walking nonsense." Alicia's jaw clenched, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the sweat beginning to bead on her forehead, but it wasn't from the heat, it was the anticipation, the knowing that the situation could go from bad to worse in the blink of an eye. And then it did. Before she could even react, the officer lunged forward, grabbing her arm with a brutal force that sent shockwaves through her body. Alicia gasped, the pain shooting up her arm as he twisted it behind her back. Bruno barked loudly, a sharp, aggressive sound, but the officer simply kicked out, sending him stumbling back. Daisy's eyes flashed with rage, but Alicia could barely focus on her dogs. The pain in her shoulder overwhelmed everything else. "Let go of me," Alicia shouted, struggling to break free from the officer's grip. The sound of her voice seemed to fuel the officer's cruelty. He shoved her harder against the side of the patrol car, the metal pressing into her ribs, and she cried out, her breath stolen by the impact. "Shut your mouth, girl," the officer growled, tightening his grip until Alicia could feel her bones grinding against each other. "You think you can just walk around like this, in my town, with your damn dogs? You think you're above the law?" Alicia fought back, kicking her legs, trying to free herself, but the officer was stronger, bigger, and his grip was ironclad. The world around her began to spin as the force of his hold increased, and her head grew fuzzy from the lack of oxygen. Her vision blurred, but one thing was clear, she wasn't going to let him win. Not like this. The second officer finally got out of the patrol car, walking over slowly, like he was just waiting for the right moment to intervene. He looked at Alicia with the same cold indifference that his partner wore. There was no hesitation in his actions as he stepped up beside her, his hand moving toward the taser strapped to his belt. "Don't make me use this," the officer said, his voice low, almost casual. "You really want to find out what happens when you resist?" Alicia's blood ran cold. She knew all too well what that taser could do. The memory of seeing a man get shocked into submission not far from where she stood flickered in her mind. The sharp crack of electricity, the violent twitching, the helplessness. She had seen it, but she never imagined it would happen to her. The officer raised the taser, and without another word, Alicia felt a jolt of electricity race through her body. Her muscles spasmed uncontrollably, and she let out a scream, her body seizing as if it were on fire. She collapsed to the ground, her dogs barking frantically, but the officers were already stepping back, watching her writhing on the pavement. Bruno and Daisy continued to bark, but they were helpless. The officer kicked Bruno away again, his boot making contact with the dog's side, sending the Rottweiler sprawling. Alicia's heart broke as she heard the sickening thud of her dog hitting the ground. Bruno didn't stop barking, but he was winded, his chest heaving. Daisy was still standing strong, her body tensed, ready to spring into action, but Alicia could barely move now. The electric shock still pulsed through her system, her body shaking uncontrollably. The world was spinning, her vision a blur of shapes and colors, and for a brief moment, Alicia thought she might pass out, but through the haze, she could hear the officers laughing, mocking her, their words as sharp as knives. "That's what happens when you think you can walk free, sweetheart," one of them sneered. Alicia lay on the cold concrete, her body shaking uncontrollably from the electric shock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her chest burned with each inhalation, the pain from the taser still coursing through her veins. Her vision flickered in and out of focus, the world spinning like a bad dream. But despite the overwhelming agony, despite the terror, a fire sparked deep inside her. She wasn't done. Not yet. Her dogs were still barking frantically, their voices echoing in the stillness, desperate to protect her. Bruno, though winded, stood by her side, his body low and protective, his growl still fierce. Daisy, the smaller of the two, had moved to the edge of the patrol car, her eyes never leaving the officers. Alicia could feel the energy radiating off them, the loyalty, the protectiveness. She had always known they were her strength, but right now, they were the only thing holding her together. The officers stood above her, looking down at her like she was something to be discarded. They had done this before, broken people, humiliated them, made them feel small. But Alicia was different. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just a woman being subdued. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. They had underestimated her, and that would be their downfall. The officer who had shocked her stood with his taser still in hand, the smirk on his face telling Alicia everything she needed to know. He was savoring this moment. He thought she was done, but as he raised his foot to kick her, something inside Alicia snapped. She pushed herself up from the pavement with what little strength she had left, her body screaming in protest. The pain was unbearable, but the anger inside her was more powerful. The officer's boot came down, but Alicia was faster. She rolled out of the way just in time, and the officer stumbled, losing his balance for a brief second. That was all she needed. In one swift movement, Alicia grabbed hold of the officer's baton, which was hanging loosely from his belt. She swung it with all the force she could muster, connecting with his stomach with a sickening thud. The officer gasped, doubling over from the impact, but Alicia didn't stop. She swung again, this time across his head, the metal making contact with a sharp crack. The officer collapsed to the ground with a grunt, his hand reaching up to his bleeding head. The second officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes wide in shock, but then his hand reached for his gun. Alicia could see the flash of panic in his eyes as he fumbled for it. She couldn't let him have the upper hand. Before he could draw the weapon, Alicia was on him, her hands grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. The second officer cried out in pain, but Alicia didn't stop. She twisted harder, using the officer's own momentum to slam him into the ground. The gun fell from his hand, sliding across the asphalt. Alicia stood over both officers, her breath still ragged but her resolve unshaken. She was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was the adrenaline, the anger, the fight she had been forced into. Her dog stood close by, still growling, sensing the change in the air. Alicia looked down at the two officers, her voice low and filled with fury. "Don't think for a second that you've won," she spat. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The officer who had been knocked out of the fight struggled to rise, but Alicia quickly kicked the baton toward him, sending it just out of his reach. His eyes burned with hatred, but there was nothing he could do. His partner was on the ground, clutching his arm, gasping for air. The power had shifted in that moment, and Alicia knew it. Her dogs barked in unison, a fierce, defiant sound that echoed in the air. Bruno's growl was deep, menacing. Daisy stood beside Alicia, watching the officers carefully, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Alicia was breathing heavily, her body bruised and battered, but her spirit was stronger than ever. Alicia stood over the fallen officers, her breath heavy, her muscles aching from the fight. The pain in her body was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the fiery determination coursing through her veins. She had taken them by surprise, but now, she knew the real battle was just beginning. She could hear Bruno and Daisy growling, their voices low but unwavering, like a warning. The officers, battered and bruised, were still alive, but they weren't moving fast enough. They were dazed, shocked by the sudden turn of events. Alicia could see the disbelief in their eyes, the realization that the woman they had tried to break wasn't going down without a fight, and that was exactly what they were going to face. The first officer struggled to push himself up, his hand pressing against the pavement as he tried to steady himself. Blood dripped from the side of his head where Alicia had struck him with the baton. He gritted his teeth, trying to clear the fog from his mind, but it wasn't working. His vision swam, and the world around him tilted. "I'm gonna kill you for this," he muttered through clenched teeth, his voice thick with hatred. Alicia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already said everything with her actions. Her dog stood close by, their presence an unspoken promise of loyalty and protection. Bruno moved closer to her side, his gaze fixed on the officer, his muscles coiled, ready to act at the slightest provocation. Daisy, ever vigilant, kept her eyes on the second officer, who was still clutching his arm, struggling to get back to his feet. It was then that Alicia heard the sound of sirens in the distance, the screeching wail of emergency vehicles growing louder, closer. A momentary rush of fear flashed through her, but she quickly suppressed it. She had no intention of being caught in this mess, not when she had the upper hand. The second officer, still dazed, managed to grab his gun. Alicia saw the movement and reacted immediately. She rushed forward, faster than he could react, knocking the weapon from his hand with a swift kick. The gun clattered to the ground, skidding away from his reach. He scrambled to grab it, but it was too late. "Stay down," Alicia commanded, her voice low but unwavering. "If you don't want this to get worse, stay down." The officer hesitated, his hand hovering near his gun, but his body was too battered to move with any real strength. The fight had left him. He knew it. He knew she had won, and it was only a matter of time before backup arrived. But he wasn't going down without a final attempt at dominance. Alicia watched as he pulled a knife from his belt, a desperate, last-ditch effort to regain control. But she was faster. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with a vice-like grip, twisting it until the knife fell from his hand, clattering across the pavement. The officer gasped in pain, but Alicia didn't stop. She kicked the knife away, her gaze never leaving his eyes. "You should have stayed out of it," she said coldly. "Now, you're just another one who underestimated me." The sirens were now deafening, and the flashing lights painted the scene in a chaotic swirl of reds and blues. Alicia could hear the crunch of tires as more squad cars approached, the heavy boots of more officers hitting the pavement. But this time, Alicia wasn't afraid. She had taken control of this situation. She had turned the tables, and as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would never let them take that from her. Bruno and Daisy barked in unison, their loyalty unshaken, ready for whatever came next. Alicia's hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, her body battered and bruised, but her spirit was more resolute than ever. No matter what happened next, she knew one thing: she would fight to the end. The new officers arrived, surrounding her and the fallen ones. The air was thick with tension, but Alicia didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes cold, her breath steady. She wasn't the same woman who had been pushed around before. She wasn't the same woman who had been targeted for no reason other than the color of her skin. And when the new officers started shouting at her, commanding her to get on the ground, she stood taller. She wasn't afraid of them, not anymore. The sound of boots hitting the pavement echoed in the stillness, a rhythmic reminder of the tension that hung thick in the air. Alicia could feel the weight of the approaching officers, their presence oppressive, but she refused to let fear take root. Her breath was steady now, even if her body still ached from the electric shock, the bruises, and the sharp, searing pain that coursed through her every muscle. She had been through worse. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The second set of officers, arriving in full force, fanned out, surrounding her and the two wounded men on the ground. They were all wearing their uniforms, the badges of authority gleaming under the streetlights. But Alicia wasn't fooled. She knew the truth. These were the same men who had sworn to uphold justice. But instead, they had been complicit in the very system that oppressed and tortured people like her. Their eyes told a story she had seen far too many times: suspicion, arrogance, and a hint of contempt. One officer, tall and broad-shouldered, approached first. His eyes were steely, calculating, assessing her as though she were a threat to be neutralized. Alicia met his gaze with the same intensity, unwavering, unbroken. He stopped a few paces away, his hand resting on his gun. The tension was palpable, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "You're making a big mistake, lady," he said, his voice low, laced with thinly veiled menace. "You don't know who you're messing with." Alicia didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, these threats, these empty warnings. She had lived through worse, fought against it all her life. The words meant nothing. She could feel Bruno and Daisy at her side, their bodies tense, their eyes trained on the officers, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. They were her family, her only protection in this hostile world. And they, too, understood what was at stake. The officer took a step forward, and that's when the first shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at Alicia. It was aimed at one of the fallen officers. He had begun to stir, trying to crawl toward his gun, the one Alicia had knocked out of his reach. The shot hit him in the leg, and the man screamed, a desperate, pained wail that echoed through the street. Blood poured from the wound, staining the concrete. Alicia didn't have time to process the horror of what had just happened. Her focus snapped back to the officer who had fired the shot. He was standing with his gun aimed directly at the injured man, a cruel smirk on his face. "Just in case you were thinking about getting up," the officer said, his voice dripping with mockery, We're not here to negotiate." Alicia's heart raced, her hands trembling. The sound of the gunshot reverberated in her chest, but she had no time to hesitate. She moved with a speed she didn't know she still had, reaching for the baton on the ground, the one she had knocked out of the first officer's hands. The pain in her legs nearly crippled her, but she didn't stop. She could feel the heat of the moment, the anger rising in her throat like bile, the injustice of it all, the disregard for life, for her life, for any life that wasn't white and subservient. The officer who had shot the injured man turned toward her, his expression hardening, his hand twitching toward his holster. It was clear now, he wanted her gone. He didn't care that she was a woman, that she had just fought off two of his colleagues. He wanted to end her. But Alicia was faster. She lunged, her hand gripping the baton, and with a roar of defiance, she swung it with all the strength she could muster, hitting the officer square in the chest. The impact knocked him backward, and he stumbled, his gun falling to the ground. He tried to recover, but Alicia was already on him, her fists landing on his face in rapid succession. The blows were precise, calculated, driven by a lifetime of rage and pain that had been pent up inside her, only now finding its release. The officer crumpled under the assault, blood spattering across the pavement, his face contorting in agony. Alicia didn't stop until he was on the ground, his body unmoving. She stood over him, chest heaving, her mind a blur of anger and adrenaline. But as the silence settled in, the gravity of what had just transpired began to sink in. She had taken down 3 officers, 3 men who had tried to break her, but she couldn't let herself revel in the victory, not yet. There were still more to face. From the corner of her eye, Alicia saw the officers surrounding the first fallen officer. Their attention split. They hadn't seen her move yet, but they knew something had shifted in the air. There was a pause, just a moment, where the world seemed to hold its breath. That's when the second shot rang out. The blast came from behind her. She whipped around, just in time to see another officer, a female this time, with her gun raised, aiming it directly at Bruno, who had been standing close by, watching the scene unfold. The dog's growl echoed deep in his chest, a low warning, but the officer's finger was already on the trigger. "No!" Alicia screamed, her heart lurching. The shot rang out in the stillness, but it wasn't aimed at Bruno, it was aimed at her. In that split second, everything slowed. Alicia could feel the pressure of the gunpowder, the deafening blast, the way her breath froze in her chest. Her mind screamed for her to move, but her body wasn't fast enough. The bullet pierced her side, a searing pain ripping through her abdomen, and for a moment, the world went black. The world around Alicia spun wildly, the edges of her vision blurring as her body betrayed her, crumpling under the weight of the bullet lodged deep in her side. The pain was unbearable, sharp, and insistent, radiating from her abdomen like a firestorm, scorching every inch of her being. Her knees buckled, and for a moment, she thought she might fall into the abyss of darkness. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The world around her seemed to slow down, the sounds muffled, as though she were drowning in a vast, suffocating sea of blood and fear. Alicia's hands shook as they pressed against the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding, but the blood was pouring out faster than she could contain it. Her vision flickered, and for a moment, she wondered if this was how it would all end. Would she die here, on this cold street, her life slipping away like sand through an hourglass, her body discarded like nothing more than a piece of trash? But then, she heard it, the sound that had kept her going through the worst of times, the sound of paws pounding on the pavement, followed by the low, guttural growl that could only belong to her loyal dogs. Bruno and Daisy had rushed to her side, their presence as grounding as it was life-affirming. They circled her, their bodies close, shielding her from the officers who were still advancing, their guns raised, ready to finish the job. "Stay back," one of the officers shouted, his voice harsh and panicked. "Get those dogs under control." But Alicia couldn't respond. Her lips felt numb, her mouth dry, but she knew her dogs. They were more than just animals, they were family. They knew what to do. Bruno, the larger of the two, stood between Alicia and the officers, his body tense, ready to spring into action. Daisy, smaller but just as fierce, darted around, her sharp eyes never leaving the officers, her growls vibrating through the tense air. The officers hesitated, their eyes flicking nervously between the dogs and Alicia. They had been trained to handle people, but they were not trained to handle a dog's ferocity. Not like this. They had underestimated Alicia. They had underestimated the loyalty of her companions. "Get back," the officer barked again, stepping closer, his hand inching toward his gun. But that was the wrong move. Bruno let out a deafening bark, his teeth bared in a vicious snarl, and without hesitation, he lunged toward the officer, his jaw snapping just inches from the man's arm. The officer jumped back, eyes wide with fear, but he had already made the fatal mistake of moving too close. Daisy, ever quick, darted forward, biting the man's leg with a savage force that caused him to scream in pain, his hands flailing wildly as he tried to shake her off. Alicia could feel the darkness creeping in, but she knew her dogs were holding their ground, protecting her as best as they could. The officer who had shot her was still standing, his gun raised, but his attention was divided, and that gave Alicia the chance she needed. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached down to the ground, her fingers trembling as they grasped the edge of a metal pipe, discarded from the earlier chaos. She pulled it toward her, her grip tightening around it, the metal cool against her hand. The officer's eyes widened when he saw her movement, and before he could react, Alicia swung the pipe upward, aiming for his chest. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and the officer staggered back, his gun slipping from his hands as he crashed into the pavement. The air was thick with the sounds of violence, barks, shouts, the clanging of metal on stone, and the rapid, uneven beat of Alicia's heart. She fought to stay conscious, to stay alive, but the blood loss was overwhelming, and the pull of unconsciousness grew stronger with every passing second. Alicia's vision was fading. She could feel the cold creeping into her limbs, the weight of exhaustion dragging her down, but she couldn't let go. Not yet. She had to keep fighting. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for those who were counting on her, for the community that had never stopped believing in her. Bruno and Daisy were still engaged with the officers, their loyalty unshakable. But Alicia could feel herself slipping. It was a race now. Could she get to her feet in time to save herself? Could she stand against the officers long enough to escape the hell they had brought down on her? Alicia's fingers tightened around the pipe again, her knuckles white. She couldn't let the darkness win. She couldn't let them take her life. Alicia's body was giving in, piece by piece. The wound in her side burned like an eternal flame, and her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, each inhale a battle against the pain that threatened to drown her. Her vision was flickering in and out of focus, and she could feel the coldness creeping further up her limbs, as though the life was slowly draining from her. Yet, despite everything, she fought. She fought for air, for her life, for the promise that she could make it through this, even when everything inside of her screamed to give up. Bruno and Daisy were still locked in the chaos of the moment, fiercely protecting her from the officers. Bruno had cornered one officer near a dumpster, his powerful jaws snapping at the man's arm, sending the officer tumbling backward with a scream. Daisy, meanwhile, had managed to knock another officer off his feet, her quick movements a blur of fury. She had always been the smaller of the two, but now, in the midst of this violence, her size didn't matter. She was a beast, a protector in every sense of the word. The remaining officer, the one who had shot Alicia, was still recovering from the blow to his chest. His breath came in ragged bursts as he stumbled backward, his hand pressed against the wound that was bleeding heavily. His eyes were wild, his gun now discarded on the ground, and the fear was evident in his shaking hands. "Stay away from me," he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Alicia, his voice high-pitched with panic. He had lost control, and he knew it. Alicia barely registered his words. Her mind was clouded, the world shifting between flashes of light and dark, but she knew that she couldn't afford to lose consciousness. Not now. Not with everything on the line. She had to make it. She had to survive. Her heart pounded as she tried to rise, her body trembling with the effort. With each movement, she felt her strength slipping away, but she wasn't alone. Bruno was still there, his massive frame a shield, and Daisy, ever alert, was watching the remaining officer, her growls low and threatening. They were her lifeline now, her only chance. She just had to hold on a little longer. But then, the officer managed to draw his taser. His eyes, filled with desperation, locked onto Alicia as he aimed it at her chest. "No," she screamed, her voice raw and hoarse from the pain. The sound of the taser firing was like thunder in her ears, and before she could even react, the electricity surged through her body, a violent shock that sent her crashing to the ground. Her body convulsed uncontrollably, the pain intensifying as she writhed, unable to stop the spasms of agony. Every fiber of her being screamed for release, but the current held her captive. Her world went dark. The last thing she remembered was the image of Bruno, desperately trying to reach her, his eyes wide with panic. The world was spinning in violent circles, a blur of darkness and light. Alicia's body lay on the ground, trembling and convulsing, her mind a fog of confusion and pain. Every inch of her felt like it was on fire, the electric shock from the taser still coursing through her, leaving her muscles twitching uncontrollably. Her breath was ragged, each gasp a struggle against the suffocating pressure building in her chest. The searing pain in her side, the bullet wound, was nothing compared to the torment of the taser's electric pulses. She could feel her body failing her, each second ticking away like a countdown to her inevitable collapse. But despite the overwhelming agony, she fought to hold on, to stay conscious. She had to. For herself, for Bruno, for Daisy. They needed her. Her mind struggled to stay focused, the world around her shifting in and out of clarity. Through the haze, she could hear Bruno's low growls and Daisy's frantic barks, the dogs standing guard, their bodies still between her and the officers, protecting her with everything they had. One of the officers, still trying to regain his composure from the earlier struggle, stepped forward, gun in hand. His movements were hesitant, uncertain. He had never intended for this situation to escalate this far, but now it was too late. His eyes, wide with fear, flicked between Alicia's motionless form and the snarling dogs. Just let her go, man, the officer cried out to his partner, his voice shaking with the realization that they were in over their heads. We didn't sign up for this. We didn't mean for it to go this far, but his partner, an older man with a hardened face, didn't waver. His eyes were cold, calculating, focused on one thing, ending this nightmare. The woman on the ground had become an obstacle, and obstacles had to be removed. No, he said, his voice like ice. We finish what we started. He raised his gun, aiming directly at Alicia's head. Bruno's growls grew louder, his stance widening, his body tensing like a coiled spring ready to explode. Daisy, too, was moving, darting between Alicia and the officers, her teeth bared in a furious snarl. But even they could feel it, the tension in the air, the cold certainty of what was about to happen. The officer's gun, raised high, was a harbinger of death, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Alicia could barely keep her eyes open, but she saw it, the glint of the gun, the officer's finger on the trigger, the sense that her time had come. Her body wanted to give in, to surrender to the darkness that beckoned her, but something inside her refused. She couldn't die like this. Not now. Not when her dogs, her family, were still fighting for her. Not when she had fought so hard to survive. Bruno. Daisy, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Stay with me, please, don't let them. The dogs reacted immediately, their loyalty and love for Alicia making them blind to the danger. Bruno lunged, his massive form cutting through the air like a shadow of death, aiming for the officer with the gun. Daisy, with her agility and speed, followed suit, her movements a blur of aggression and fury. The older officer fired. The gunshot rang out like a thunderclap, deafening in its suddenness, but it didn't hit Alicia, it didn't even hit the dogs. The bullet missed, striking the pavement inches away from Bruno's feet. The officer had missed, but that didn't matter. The action, the movement, had triggered something in Alicia. The sound, the force, the surge of fear, it reignited a spark in her that she thought had long since died. Her hands shook, but she reached for the pipe once again, the cold metal reassuring in her grasp. With a strength she didn't know she had left, she pushed herself onto her elbows, forcing her body to move, to survive. The blood was pouring from her wound, staining the ground beneath her, but she couldn't stop now, not when the end was so close. The officer who had fired the shot was distracted, momentarily thrown off by the failed shot and the ensuing chaos. That was all Alicia needed. She swung the pipe with everything she had, a desperate, wild strike that caught the officer off guard. The blow hit him in the shoulder, knocking him back and sending him sprawling to the ground, his weapon slipping from his hands. Alicia's heart raced, her vision blurry, but she was alive. She had fought back. She wasn't done yet. The officers were stunned, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. Bruno and Daisy were relentless in their defense, standing guard over Alicia, their bodies a constant barrier between her and the remaining officers. But the fight wasn't over, not yet. The air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke, the tension so dense that it felt like the very ground they stood on might split open at any moment. Alicia's vision was still clouded, her head spinning from the violent shock of the taser. The bullet wound in her side, making every movement feel like an eternity of pain. Her blood had soaked into the dirt beneath her, mixing with the filth and grime of the alleyway, a stark reminder of the brutality she was enduring. But she was still alive. Bruno and Daisy were beside her, their loyalty to her unwavering. Even as the remaining officers adjusted their stances, they were not only outnumbered, but now, they were also outmatched. Alicia's dogs, Bruno, the fierce, protective force, and Daisy, the agile, determined fighter, had proven to be a force to be reckoned with. Despite their size and strength, they were not invincible, but they fought with a passion that could rival anything. One of the officers, the older one with a grizzled face, was reloading his gun, his hands shaking as he did so. The man was scared. Scared of the dogs, scared of the woman who refused to die, despite everything they had thrown at her, and perhaps, deep down, he was scared of the world they had created, the one that had led them to this brutal, desperate moment. "Get up," he barked at his partner, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to finish this, now." The younger officer, still bleeding from the wound Alicia had inflicted on him, stumbled to his feet, his face pale, his movements slow and hesitant. The fear was all over him now. He had signed up to serve and protect, but somewhere along the way, his sense of justice had been lost. Now, it was too late to back out, too late to regret the choices that had led him here. Alicia could hear their words, even through the fog of pain clouding her senses. She could feel their desperation, but she could also feel something else, the will to survive, the refusal to let her story end in this dark alley, alone and forgotten. She wasn't alone, though, not anymore. "Bruno, Daisy," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. "We finished this together." Her hands were slick with blood, but her grip on the pipe tightened. Despite the overwhelming darkness that threatened to consume her, she could still move, still fight. She had to. The older officer raised his gun again, this time aiming at Bruno, his finger curled around the trigger, ready to end the struggle once and for all. But before he could pull it, Daisy darted forward, faster than a flash, and sank her teeth into his leg. He screamed in agony, the sound of his pain mingling with the growls of the two dogs. Bruno moved in then, his massive body charging forward like a freight train, knocking the officer to the ground with a bone-crushing force. The officer who had fired earlier was still dazed, his vision clouded from the blow he had received. But he wasn't done yet. He staggered to his feet, his hands shaking violently, his eyes wild with terror. He knew what he had to do, but in the back of his mind, he was wondering how it had all come to this. He had been the one who had fired the first shot, who had set this nightmare in motion, but it didn't matter now. All that mattered was finishing what they had started. With a trembling hand, he aimed his weapon at Alicia once more. "Stay down, damn it," he yelled, his voice cracking under the pressure. But Alicia didn't stay down. With the last of her strength, she forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her as she willed herself to stand. The world around her was a blur, but she knew what she had to do. She had to make it stop. She had to fight until her last breath. Bruno and Daisy were still on the older officer, the younger one still struggling to recover from the injuries they had inflicted. She saw the hesitation in his eyes. For a moment, there was a flicker of doubt. He was realizing, just like Alicia, that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for something far bigger, something that had been lost long ago. The officer hesitated. That hesitation was all Alicia needed. With one final cry, she lunged forward, using the pipe like a spear. She drove it into the officer's chest with everything she had left. The force of the blow knocked the breath out of him, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His weapon slipped from his hands, and the alley was silent except for the labored breathing of those still standing. Alicia stood over him, blood dripping from her side, sweat pouring down her face. Her body was broken, but her spirit was unshaken. She had survived, and somehow, in that moment, she felt more alive than ever. But this victory came at a cost. The older officer, still groaning in pain, was struggling to get back to his feet. He wasn't done yet. He still had his gun, and in his eyes, Alicia could see the cold resolve to finish what they had started. "Damn you," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You won't win." But Alicia's voice, weak as it was, held a strength he couldn't deny. "I already have," she said, her words a defiant whisper. The cold night air felt like a slap against Alicia's face as she stood over the fallen officers. Her breathing was labored, her heart racing, the wound in her side pulsing with each beat. She had done it. She had fought, but at what cost? Her body was broken, battered, bloodied, but her will remained unyielding. Bruno and Daisy stood guard beside her, their eyes still sharp, their protective instincts on full display. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The night was far from finished, and the world around them was a powder keg waiting for a spark to ignite it all. But for now, Alicia had survived. She glanced down at the two officers, sprawled on the ground like discarded rag dolls. One was twitching slightly, the other was motionless. The older one, the one who had been the most brutal of them all, was still gasping for air, clutching at his side where the pipe had struck him. His face was pale, covered in dirt and sweat, but there was a certain grim satisfaction in Alicia's eyes as she watched him struggle. He deserved this. Every ounce of pain that he was feeling, every breath he struggled to take, was a small piece of the justice she had been denied for far too long. She had fought back. She had refused to let them win. But that didn't mean she was done. She stepped forward, her legs shaking under her, but her resolve was unwavering. "Stay down," she whispered, her voice like gravel as she looked down at the officer's pained face. The words weren't just for him, they were for the whole system that had been so determined to crush her, to keep her down, to make her a victim. But she wasn't a victim anymore. The younger officer, the one who had been bleeding out from the gunshot wound, was still twitching on the ground, his eyes unfocused, his hand reaching weakly for his weapon. He was a mess, physically and mentally. The fear in his eyes was palpable. It wasn't just fear of death. It was the fear of everything he had been taught, everything he had been trained to believe, coming crashing down around him. And, Alicia realized, that was the worst part. He wasn't just a man who had hurt her. He wasn't just a cop who had followed orders. He was a product of a broken system, a system that had shaped him into someone who believed his actions were justified. He had been trained to see her as less than human, to treat her like an object, a criminal, a threat. But now, as she stood over him, there was no denying it. He had failed. He had been part of the machinery of hatred, but in this moment, he was the one who was broken. Her hand tightened around the pipe, the middle slick with blood. "You don't get to go back to your life," she whispered. "Not after this." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. She knew what they meant. She wasn't just talking to him. She was talking to every person who had ever turned a blind eye, every person who had stood by and watched as she, and so many like her, were torn apart by the very system they were supposed to trust. She raised the pipe above her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, everything stopped. The world around her seemed to freeze. There was only her and the two officers, their fates hanging in the balance. And then, with a scream of pain and rage, she brought the pipe down. It crashed against the ground with a sickening thud, but she didn't strike him again. No, she wasn't going to kill him, not yet. Instead, she stood there, her entire body shaking, her chest heaving. She couldn't stop the tears that were falling now, the rage and sadness that had built up inside of her for so long finally breaking free. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about something deeper, something that went beyond her pain. This was about justice. She turned away from the fallen officers, walking slowly, painfully, toward the edge of the alley. Her dogs followed, their loyalty never in question. The sound of their paws hitting the pavement echoed in the night, and Alicia felt a small sense of peace, though the storm in her chest had yet to settle. She knew what was coming next. The fight was far from over. Alicia's body was battered, her movements slow and deliberate as she made her way through the dark alley, her dogs by her side. Bruno and Daisy stayed close, their vigilance unwavering, sensing the danger that still loomed. But for now, there was a different kind of silence, an unsettling peace that hung over the moment. It felt like the calm before the storm. The battle was far from over, but the first step had been taken. The night was closing in, but Alicia had a sense that things were about to change. She knew that it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about dismantling everything that had been built on hatred and fear, everything that had pushed her and so many others to the edge of destruction. It was time for justice, real justice. The two officers she had left behind were still unconscious, but Alicia knew they wouldn't be the last. The wheels of fate were turning, and soon the system that had failed her would begin to crumble. She could feel it. The world was watching. It had been a long time since she had trusted anyone in a position of power, but she had been wrong to believe that nothing would change. The tides were shifting. People had had enough. As Alicia stood at the edge of the alley, she could hear sirens in the distance. She felt no fear. This time, the law would not be able to protect the corrupt. The officers who had terrorized her, the ones who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of so many, would now face the consequences of their actions. They wouldn't be able to escape the justice that was coming for them. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had been hurt, who had been crushed under the boot of a system that valued power over humanity. The first police cars arrived. Alicia didn't flinch. She didn't need to run anymore. There was nowhere to hide, and she had nothing to fear. But when the officers stepped out of their cars, it wasn't just the two from the alley. A dozen more arrived, their uniforms crisp, their faces hard with determination. But something had changed in their eyes. There was a tremor of doubt, a flicker of realization that maybe they weren't the ones who were right. Maybe they had been wrong all along. The people had spoken, and now the tide was turning. There were protests everywhere, growing louder, stronger. The citizens were demanding change. The corrupt officers were being stripped of their badges one by one, and those who had witnessed the brutality firsthand knew that their silence had to end. Alicia's moment of reckoning was not a singular victory. It was a part of something much larger, something unstoppable. The officers were arrested, their actions finally brought to light. Investigations into their abuse of power became public, and with it, the terrifying truth about the systematic racism that had stained every corner of law enforcement. As the officers were taken away in handcuffs, there was no cheering, no sense of triumph. There was only a quiet acknowledgement that this was just the beginning, that the work of undoing the damage of years, decades, of suffering would not be easy, but it was possible. The system, once so impenetrable, was beginning to crack. Alicia stood tall as the officers were driven away, their faces pale, their bodies stiff with fear. It was the first time she felt a sense of relief. They had lost, and she had won, not for herself, but for everyone who had been a victim of their cruelty. The dogs, loyal and fierce, stood by her side. Bruno and Daisy's eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon, but they knew this was over. The storm had passed. The air felt clearer. Alicia could finally breathe without that crushing weight on her chest. The law had failed her, but karma had found a way. The battle wasn't finished, but it was won. And Alicia was not the same person who had stumbled into that alley a few days ago. She had been forged by fire, tempered by pain, but she had emerged stronger. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for change, for the future, for every person who would no longer have to live in fear. This was just the beginning.